Welcome to Presidential Fight Club, the show that answers the question, if all 44 presidents fought each other one-on-one, who would win? Hosted by two history professors who have too much time on their hands, Scott Rank and James Early. Welcome to the final fight in round 3 of the Western Regional, the classic presidential versus vice presidential matchup. And we're not talking about George Herbert Walker Bush versus Dan Quayle, although that'd be very interesting, but Ronald Reagan versus George Herbert Walker Bush. We last saw Reagan take out LBJ, where athleticism prevailed against the psychological warfare that LBJ unleashed. So, James, what would Reagan bring in a fight against his vice president?
Well, Ronald Reagan, I talked a little about his early life and his being a lifeguard, his athleticism, and his desire to fight for his country, even though he couldn't see very well. That might be a strike against him, although he did wear either glasses or contacts his entire life. I want to talk a little about when Reagan was older. Reagan, of course, if you're going to be a Hollywood actor, you've got to stay thin and fit and trim, pretty much, at least you used to back in the day. But Reagan continued to swim. He was a very good swimmer, of course, having been a lifeguard. He also lifted weights well into his 70s. I mean, even when he was in the White House, he had the White House gym upgraded. And I remember when I was a teenager and he was president, I remember often they'd show photos of him lifting weights, and sometimes he'd be wearing a suit. He'd be like curling a barbell or something. And the man's 70 and eventually 75 years old. You know, he was basically 70 right after he was inaugurated. And so he was, when he left office, he was pushing 80 and he was still strong as can be. And there is a story that says, let's talk about him. Well, let's talk about the weightlifting too. Let me do some more. He had a gym installed in the White House, and he gained so much muscle that he had to buy new suits. Now that's pretty amazing. Okay. That would be impressive if you were in your 40s, but he was in his 70s and he just kept packing on the muscle. And then of course, another vignette from his life that I want to mention. I won't talk too much about his career, just briefly. He was a movie actor for a while, and then his movie career kind of went down the tubes, and he ended up being on TV for a while, hosting a show, and then he became the governor of California. He unsuccessfully ran for president in 1968, and then in 1976, he challenged the sitting president, Gerald Ford. That doesn't happen very often. So that takes some guts, but not long after he was president, he was shot. There was an attempt made on his life by a crazy fellow named John Hinckley Jr. He was trying to impress the actress Jodie Foster, which these guys, their reasons for shooting presidents are all just completely whacked out. I mean, crazy. But anyway, so Reagan, he gets shot and they push him into a car and they drive him off to the hospital. And then when they get to the hospital, he just walks in casually like nothing's happened. He didn't get in a wheelchair or anything like that. The bullet ends up missing his heart just by inches. And his wife asks what happened, and he says, "Honey, I forgot to duck." I should do his voice. That'd be funny. But and then he's just totally unflappable, calm, cool, and collected, and never mind the fact that he's got a bullet inches away from his heart. He's been shot. No, he forgot to duck. That's it. He's still cracking jokes. He was always a very funny man. And when they were just about to put him under the knife and give him his anesthesia and have surgery on him, he says to the doctor, "Doctor, I hope you're a Republican." And the doctor says, "Well, sir, we're all Republicans today." His doctor later said that he had the physique of a 30-year-old muscle builder. And again, this is an elderly man by any stretch of the imagination, a man in his 70s. So Reagan didn't have a lot of experience with bare knuckle combat or martial arts or anything like that, boxing, but he was just strong as could be, and he was tough. And I think this is an interesting match. He's going against his own vice president. He and George Bush actually liked each other quite a bit. They they had kind of an ugly primary campaign because Bush was also running for president in 1980. But they made up, and Reagan, of course, added him to the ticket, and they had a very close relationship, and Reagan wholeheartedly endorsed Bush in 1988. So I think if they really had to fight, they would probably, Reagan was an actor, so he'd say, George, let's make it look good. And they'd probably fake it, not really punch each other. But I just think that's interesting that we ended up just by coincidence having a president versus his VP. Some people thought it would be cool or interesting if we had George H.W. Bush versus George W. Bush, because we did have a father-son matchup in the Northeast Regional with the two Adamses squaring off, but that just it wasn't in the cards. It didn't work out. So anyway, there's Reagan. He's not necessarily a super experienced fighter, but tough and strong and unflappable.
Let's hope he keeps advancing, keep the Reagan impersonations coming.
Oh, well, I'll try, Scott. I don't know if I can keep this up all night, but I'll try.
We've had a few going in. Okay, JFK is obvious, and I don't really know what LBJ sounds like. I just imagine Foghorn Leghorn. And
no, that's more like
pretty close.
That's more like Mississippi or Louisiana.
Okay,
Johnson's a little different. He's more of a West Texas accent. I could do it, but we'll see.
I think Trump tried to pull that out earlier. So if you want to go way back in the archives, there's Trump for you. Mm-hmm. Anyway, getting to the fight at hand. So Bush 41, I'm excited to talk about him because I mentioned in the previous fight with Truman that I think he's one of the great dark horses of this race. And that's because the image you think of him is probably the 92 re-election campaign against Bill Clinton, where he's called a wimp. He's the previous generation's candidate, and then Bill Clinton is the cool baby boomer candidate who's going to bring things into the late 20th century, whatever you want to call it. And I remember on Saturday Night Live when they were doing the mock debate between Clinton and Bush 41, there was a segment where one candidate, you could see them staring for a long time at the other person to get a sense of how the other candidate viewed them. And when you see Clinton peering over at Bush, what pops up is him dressed up like a grandmother, but he was not a grandmother. So first of all, as we mentioned, he was a Navy pilot in World War II. He shot down and received the Distinguished Flying Cross. He also entered into the Aviation Corps of the Navy and becomes one of the youngest naval aviators, or he was the youngest naval aviator at the date which he entered. And then beyond that, he was a pretty tough guy in his younger years, which is when this fight takes place. During his 20s and his early 30s, he's working like crazy as an independent oil man and worrying over business deals down in Texas. He doesn't slow down until he has a bleeding intestinal ulcer, which literally knocks him to the floor. And his doctor says that he's headed for an early grave if he keeps this up. And so he has to slow down his pace, but tough wildcatter in the hot plains of Texas, hero in World War II. And that doesn't even get into when he was the head of the CIA. I think this is in the 70s, if I have my chronology right. So although he's not a field agent, you wouldn't imagine Jason Bourne and knowing all these advanced tactics. You could imagine him using advanced interrogation techniques. So as a spy master, if he ever incepted Ronald Reagan, and if he says a few words that will trigger him into some sort of mental collapse, Bush, as a spy master and head of the CIA, could say those words during that fight to make him conk out. So just a couple of other things about Bush. Tall guy, 6'2", about 200 pounds when he became president, fairly thin, kind of hard of hearing, which is something that happened when he, due to the noise exposure he had in World War II with all the engine aircraft. A couple of things about his personality. One thing that Roger Ailes, a media consultant, said about him is that George is not John Wayne. He's more like Gary Cooper in High Noon. He's gentle. He'd much rather talk than fight, but he's capable of taking care of himself. And he also emerges as tough and tenacious in different times. One is, like James mentioned, the 1980 primary, also in the 1988 campaign, and during Operation Desert Storm, during the Persian Gulf War. Had the universal respect of people about how decisively he led that war. Didn't lead to a re-election, but for a while there, he was really riding high in the polls. So you have someone who's tenacious, war hero, CIA chief, tall guy, able to handle the plains of Texas as a wildcatter. So that's why I think he's going to win this presidential, vice presidential brawl. But does he, James?
Well, this is another close one. Both of these men deserve a lot of respect, and they're both tough guys, but I'm afraid Reagan is just a little bit tougher with all that swimming and all the pulling people out of the water and all the wood chopping and all the weightlifting, so Reagan gets the edge.
Okay, well, Reagan advances, and he's going to go up against Dwight Eisenhower in the final match of the Western Regional. See you there. Thanks for listening to Presidential Fight Club. If you'd like to download your own printable bracket sheets for each regional tournament so you can guess how the tournament will go, check out presidentialfightclub.com. We'd appreciate it if you could rate and review us on Apple Podcasts as well. Thanks for listening, and may you fight with the stamina of Teddy Roosevelt, the courage of George Washington, and the reach of Abraham Lincoln.